Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Greg Chapman Show. This is a show mainly meant for facilitators, trainers, educators, conducting workshops, training programs virtually or face-to-face on any kind of behavioral topic, ranging from leadership to self-awareness to high-performing teams and so on. The idea of this long-form conversation is to help fellow trainers and facilitators learn techniques, change mindsets, or bust many facilitation myths. Tips and tricks to find their way in here. All of this from masters of the craft from across the world. So if you're starting out or if you've been at it for a long time, you'll find something in here. Today's guest is Glenda Ouyang. And Glenda thrives at the edges, is what she tells me. Thrives at the edges between theory and practice, between order and chaos, between past and future. Since 1986, she has drawn lessons from complexity science to help people thrive in turbulent and uncertain environments. Today, more than ever, her work offers insights, options for action, and well-being for people around the world. And she's the founding executive director of Human System Dynamics Institute. Glenda leads a global community of over 800 scholar practitioners. They work across sectors to build adaptive capacity for individuals, teams, institutions, and communities. For more information about Glenda and her work with HSD, you could visit www.hsdinstitute.org. Once again, www.hsdinstitute.org. And welcome to the show, Glenda.
Thank you, Greg. I'm happy to be here.
And, the four truths, Glenda. This is you've pluralized truth. What are these? And if you could tell us a little bit about them.
We found them to be more and more useful in this year. So I began to talk about the four truths when I was facilitating a group of two very different professions that were supposed to be collaborating on a single project. And they were nurses and social workers. And they each had very strong ideas about what should happen, but they had to agree. And they had been working on agreement for about 3 months and couldn't come to agreement. And so as I was facilitating them, they called me in at the 4th month. And usually I can help a group come together. But boy, it took me 3 meetings. And as I was driving home from the 3rd meeting, I was thinking, something is going on here. And I realized that they had different claims for what was true. And so I came home and read everything I could about truths to try to figure out how I could think about and share with them the idea of truth. And what I found was a 20th century philosopher named Habermas, and he calls it something different. But essentially what it says is that there are four.
Sorry to interrupt. Before you go, if you could just say that again, please. Habermas. How do you spell that?
Habermas, Habermas. Habermas. And he talks about 4 ways of seeing, 4 kinds of stories. And one is the truth that you tell yourself. So the thing that you really believe so deeply that it doesn't matter what anyone else is going to say, it's true for you. The second kind of truth is one that a group comes to. So when people come together and make agreements, what they agree to is true. It's called normative truth. And the third is the thing that we very often call truth, which is evidence-based, and that's objective truth. And the fourth kind of truth that we call complex truth says all of those others are true all the time, but you just focus on the one that's most useful. So if you and I have work to do together, what we build is a shared normative truth, but you don't have to prove to me that your subjective truth is right. I don't need to prove to you that my subjective truth is right. But what we can do is find a truth that is functional for us together. And all of the truths are good, but you get in trouble when you confuse them. So if you and I think that our normative truth is objective and we try to force other people to agree to it, then we're going to be in trouble. It's not going to work. If I think my subjective truth should be our normative truth, we're not going to be able to get very far because we'll get stuck. And so these 4 truths we found very useful in helping people get past the ways that they get stuck in disagreement. So what's the most important truth and how can we find an agreement about it? So that's why we say 4 truths. I find it really useful in facilitation when people are stuck in arguments, different perspectives, trying to convince each other, and they're stuck. I can ask them, so of what you're saying, what is it your own truth? What is your shared truth? And what is the data objective truth? And almost always they're stuck on not recognizing that their own subjective truth belongs just to them.
So objective truth, that which with data and numbers, subjective truth is something that I believe to be true. And what I believe to be true could be different from what you believe to be true. And when a bunch of people come together and there are certain norms out of which we should operate, then that becomes a truth for that group. So the normative truth, and then of course, there's the complex truth. I think something that you also talk about, the container that's containing all the truths, and that's complex and seen. So have I kind of got that right?
And as a facilitator, if I want to touch some subjective truths in the room, I'll ask people to tell stories because their own stories reveal what is most true for them. If I need to build normative truth, I invite dialogue. And objective truth, the evidence is data, whatever that looks like, sometimes quantitative, sometimes qualitative, but data that people hold together.
So in fact,
it's a way that a group can kind of flow like water through a problem.
Flow like water through a problem. In fact, I wanted to ask you as you were speaking that if you go out and ask someone, what's your objective truth or what's your subjective truth? It's difficult, I'm assuming, that for someone to pull out and say, hey, this is my subjective truth. It may not be true. It's my subjective truth. There could be other truths out there. So how do you do that? And what I hear you say is, so for subjective truths, you get people to tell stories. For normative truth, there's dialogue. And for objective truth, you're also looking at the data. Now, how do you decide which way do you want to go? Do you want to go with the objective, or is there a predefined sequence? How do you process that?
It's a really good question. It depends on the work that you're trying to do as a facilitator. What's the goal of the conversation or the action that you're facilitating? So if you really want to be able to invite individual action and commitment, it's very important that you're speaking into people's subjective truths. If you're trying to bring a group together so that they can take action together, then the normative truth is what you need. And if you need to connect to something concrete to make a difference in the world, that there's some objective external impact that you want to make, then it's really important that you're working with data that tells you what that world is holding in this moment. And rather than, of course, most people don't know the distinction, and so asking what's your subjective truth often doesn't make a difference. But what we'll ask is, What do you know for sure?
Mhm.
And who shares that with you?
So
What do you know for sure and who agrees with that?
what do you know? That's a powerful question.
Mm.
So so when you say what's your subjective truth, that's more of an area of inquiry and less of a question. So for each area of inquiry, I'm just assuming you'd have corresponding questions which help you unpack that area of inquiry.
Yeah, and the main distinction is the subjective truth is always first person. It's about you as an individual or me as an individual. So it's one person.
Mhm.
And normative truth is we or they, so it's plural. So what's our truth? Our truth together. What's their truth together? And then for objective truth, it's more what's the truth? What is the truth? Sometimes groups are uncomfortable with the word truth, that whether for philosophical or emotional or personal reasons. So sometimes we say, what's your story? This is my story. This is our story. This is the story, which makes it a little softer and easier for people to, they don't get caught on the word truth.
I'm I'm thinking that, you know, if I could stress that a little bit and say that there are no objective truths, because this one or let me use another word, an absolute truth, because the sun rises from the east isn't true. Um, the color, I mean, so, you know, the fundamental stuff that we take for granted, let's say color of a shirt, a color of a piece of apparel. You go to the shop, there's a particular light falling on it, you take it out, go to, you know, daylight, it's a different color. So is that piece of apparel green, dark green, black? You don't know. It just depends on the light that's reflecting off it. So, you know, yeah, and I can also see that it's going to be difficult for people when you're saying truths, because we're, you know, conditioned and trained saying, hey, there's this one truth and the absolute truth. Could you give us an example? You began by
Yeah.
saying there was a group that you were working
Mhm.
with, and so how did that pan out?
So there are a couple of things. First, one is I love and would love to talk about the philosophical question about is there such a thing as truth or not?
Yeah.
I love that question. But when I'm facilitating, the question is what's most useful?
What's most useful?
So I often say, for all practical purposes, what's objective truth? Because most of the groups I talk to are not interested in going down that deep and dark philosophical pathway. Um, yeah, there are two examples I'd like to share with you. So this story that I started, I went back the next day and asked each person to write on a Post-it note everything on different Post-it notes, everything they thought was true about this particular task they were supposed to do. So people wrote Post-it notes and Post-it notes. It was a group of 12 people. And so we took each of those and I put spaces on the wall for each of the three kinds of truths, fourth being the whole thing. And we took each of their Post-it notes and said, okay, you think this is true? Is this true just for you, or does everyone in the room share it? Or do all of the nurses share it? These groups was nurses and social workers. And we would put it on. This is normative for the nurses, normative for the social workers. This is subjective truth. This is objective truth. And we sorted all of their bits into these buckets. And then we looked at it and realized that there were only three things in the objective space. Almost everything people had said, well, this is objective truth. And others in the room would say, well, no, I don't believe it, or we don't do it that way in our profession, or, and so almost everything was normative truth for one profession or the other profession. There were some subjective truths. There were very few objective truths. So the objective ones, they just went and got data. And what they realized was, okay, we have 2 normative truths in this room, but that's why we're stuck. So what we need is a shared normative truth just about this work that we're going to do. So what can we say about this work that are truths that we hold together? And how can we make that a foundation for a process that will allow us to do this work? And that was how the conversation moved forward.
So if I may just go slightly deeper with that, so how did they arrive at this conclusion that, okay, there are 2 normative truths, we're stuck? So is it because of the number? Is it because something of the content of the truth? How did they arrive at that?
They had been talking with each other for months and disagreeing about this particular task. And they realized that the truths that they held as normative separate ones had been what they were arguing about for months. So, for example, in general, social workers believe that the patient should make decisions, that's part of their really fundamental value, that the patient decides. Nurses, on the other hand, have been taught that it's the expert, the physician, or the objective truth that decides, that there's some expert who decides, and that the patient should be explained what they should do, but they shouldn't choose. So this fundamental distinction had been in the background of all of the disagreements that they had been having. And so as we began to look at a normative truth together, they decided that the decisions should be made in a negotiated way, that the expert should have a word, that the patient should have a word, and then that they should be able to have a short dialogue. And they built a little process for bringing the 2 together and doing pros and cons and then moving forward. So they built a dialogue so that they could together build a normative truth. And that was part of their process. Does that example help?
Absolutely. And how did they arrive at, okay, this is the difference that makes the difference? So is it more intuitive, or I'm sure there's more to just being intuitive. How did they arrive there?
Yeah. So the question that I asked them was, as you think about the arguments you've been having for all these months, which of these truths came up most often? Which were the ones that were most difficult for you to resolve? And they realized that this one about who makes the decisions was a big one. Another one was about risk. They believed that the nurses were more often injured in the line of practice and that they were more loyal to patients than social workers, that they talked about the social workers as 8 to 4 workers, and nurses are 24-hour workers. And of course, that was a nursing normative truth. And so they talked about, we shifted to subjective truth. And they talked about how they felt about their profession, how committed they felt. And so the fact that they were all committed to the welfare of themselves, well-being of themselves and their patients, became a normative truth. They didn't have to say, we are more committed than you are, you're more committed than we are. It was that we are all committed to the work that we're doing. That was a second normative truth that they found.
So
whereas they'd been kind of competing before about that.
So as I'm imagining, as the dialogue unfolds and you're encouraging dialogue, I think it's also about the questions, the powerful questions that you're asking, the patterns that you're stepping back and looking at and inviting other people to look at, and then arriving at something which they could take and work. And I just want to say here, maybe I'm completely off the mark, but they can. So what, whatever they're arriving at, this is what we want to work with. Maybe right, maybe close to right. I don't know if there's anything else wrong. But then they would want to come back and revisit that and say, hey, you know what, remember this whole storyboard that we had? This is where we arrived. How is it looking for you now, like 3 months, 6 months down the line?
So, Greg, you're really putting your finger on the fundamental facilitation process that we use, which we call adaptive action. And it's a cycle that we go through each time, and you'll hear it in this story. So the first question in adaptive action is what? What are we seeing? And so when I asked them all to write down their truths, that was the what step, just to get on the table what is currently going on. The second step is so what? So what does it mean? So how can we come to an understanding of it? So what meaning can we make? What sense making is there? And that was when we sorted them by subjective, objective, and normative truths. That was the so what, kind of trying to make sense of what is. And then the last step, which is now what, is what are we going to do about what we see? And that was writing their protocol and deciding to test it. And the testing was, is this good enough for us to move forward? We know it's not perfect, but is it good enough? So they began to test it. But every now what is followed by the next what, because the world is different, the pattern is different. And so each time then they'd come together and say, what are we noticing? What's working for us? What are the truths that are shifting? And so that every time they came together again, they would look at what was happening, see what adjustments need to be made, take a different action. And so that iterative process of being always in learning and testing is so important, especially in days like this of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
When things are changing, you don't know for sure what's going to happen. Being in inquiry and being in experimental action is a way of moving forward, we find.
Inquiry, experimental action, testing, I think some magic words. And also, I think implicit to what you're saying is, I'm going to do something. It's not going to be perfect. I'm going to be okay with that. I'm going to, take on a learner's lens. I'm going to look at it from a learning kind of a lens. I'm going to test it out, see what works. It's possibly not the best thing. It's a place to start. It's a place to jump off. And, then coming back, repeat what, so what, now what. I think very powerful constructs teams can use these days, especially in these times of uncertainty. I want to change gears a little, Glenda, and I want to segue in saying you use the word shifting and also the context of workshopping. So how do you shift? And what I mean by that is when you're in a workshop, you have an agenda, you have your what, as I put it that way. And the participants, they have their what. What is it that I want? What is my expectation from the facilitator? And the facilitators, here's what I want to do. Here's where I want the session to go. And I'm sure after doing it for so long, often they're the same, but often there's going to be, at loggerheads or differences. Let's not say loggerheads, let's just say differences. How do you approach that? You're in a session, you want to do something, you want to take it somewhere, the group wants something else, not on the agenda. How do you deal with that?
Well, the first thing is to be able to recognize it, that it's happening. And I find that I have almost a physical response when things are flowing nicely as I expect them to. And when I hit a block or a break or a barrier of some kind, there's almost a physical response at the beginning. So recognizing it is the first thing. The second thing I tend to do is to zoom out and to see as quickly as I can, a kind of larger frame. What's the work we're trying to do? What's the context we're working in? What was the goal of our coming together? What are the things outside the room that may be influencing what's here? And so I try to get a really broad view of what's happening to understand what the barrier is. And then I zoom back in with a question. And that question may be about process. Is this working for you? What might work better for you? But more often the question is about the content, going either a layer deeper to find normative truth that will help us move forward, or to help them zoom out to see a larger context. And so this zooming in to see what the subjective detail might be, work out details, or to zoom out to see the whole pattern more completely and clearly. And I find that one or the other of those is likely to find a pathway to get unstuck.
Yeah.
And sometimes I do that myself as a facilitator and test various things. And sometimes I invite the room to do it with me, to zoom out or to zoom in, so that they are co-creators of the path forward. And that just depends on what my agreement is with the client, what their interest and capacity is for
When
doing
would you
that.
do it individually as a facilitator? And I think I just want to be a little greedy and bundle a second question into that, saying that what are some of the indicators that tells you, hey, red flag, stop, time to zoom out. I want to go here, somebody else wants to go somewhere else. Stop. Let's relook at this very quickly. So yeah, however you want to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty easy. It's when I'm surprised.
Okay.
Right. When there's something that happens that surprises me, either someone is talking too much or someone's not talking at all, or the topic shifts, or there's tension in the room that I didn't expect. But what I'm kind of watching for is what's a surprise. And it's the surprise that puts me on pause, presses the pause button. So when will I invite people into the conversation? One of the factors is, are they really interested? Do they want to build the capacity, their capacity for solving problems? And if capacity building is an explicit part of my charge, then I'll bring them in and help them practice what we're doing. Sometimes when I facilitate, I always want to develop capacity, but sometimes it's not in my agreement with the client. And so I would tend more often to do it myself. Sometimes the people in the room just don't care, just aren't interested in building those muscles. Sometimes there's not time. There's an urgency that we need to move forward really quickly. And sometimes I know if we begin asking those questions, it will uncover unnecessary differences in the room, that it might invite disagreements and distraction about things that aren't really differences that make a difference to the work that we're doing.
And which would have been okay had you contracted differently, had more time. Otherwise, you're just opening up something which will just cause a lot more harm than good.
Yeah. No.
You use the word
That we won't be able to close in the time that we have. That's another question, is what's the time box that we're working in, and how much are we going to be really able to do in that time?
capacity. You use that word. What do you mean by that word?
We talk about particularly adaptive capacity, and that's a combination of abilities for people to be able to adjust and adapt as things change. So are they able to see clearly what's going on? Are they able to ask questions that are clear and useful? Are they able to do all the steps of adaptive action? Can they do what, so what, now what, with all of the competencies and possibilities that it takes to do that? So that's what we call adaptive capacity. Can they see? Can they understand? And can they take action and then do it again? This is true for individuals, also for groups. So that's what we call adaptive capacity. And we're finding, especially in this year of COVID and racial distress and economic disruption and so many layers of concern, that adaptive capacity has become the characteristic that helps people thrive no matter what happens. they're able to see and adapt and adjust in a way that is constructive and life-giving,
So,
even in hard circumstances.
so in these hard times, what are you seeing or feel even intuitively is a place where people need the most, I don't want to say help, but let's say clarity? Is it seeing? Is it understanding? Is it taking action?
That's a really interesting question. I think it varies. I think we're all having trouble with doing the cycle, that moving from one to the next. I think we tend to get stuck. So keeping moving is the most important thing. I think some people get stuck in what? Because they are so, their expectations are so out of match with reality. So they can't even really see what's happening because they have a different set of expectations. I think some people get stuck in the so what because they're disappointed and they want to blame someone or something for whatever is happening. They don't like it. They can't take accountability for it themselves, and so they're blaming. So their so what is so what can I blame for this problem? And I think some people get stuck in the now what, that there's such an urgency that they don't even take time to collect data and make sense. They're just acting. And so what I see is that when people are in trouble, it's because they have gotten stuck in one of those places and aren't able to move toward understanding or action or data collection. So as I've been working with people who've been in trouble in these times, that has been my most important thing, to ask myself and them, where are they stuck in the cycle and what can help them keep moving?
I think that's yet another aha moment for me in this chat of ours, unscripted, and it's just come, tumbling forth. I was looking at it as a static, and anybody needs to build seeing, or somebody needs to build understanding, or somebody needs to build the ability or capacity of taking action. But what you're saying is, yeah, everybody needs to build that. Let's also focus on the movement, from how we're moving from one to the other to the other. And what I'm also taking away is that movement will inform you, if you're zooming out enough, if you're wearing a learner's lens enough, where do you need to tinker around a little bit? What do you need to tweak some? And how do you need to make these small little changes that can help you adapt better and face a lot of situations better? You've been doing this for a long time, over 3 decades, am I right in saying that?
I have indeed.
Yes. And this is pretty deep stuff, pretty transformational stuff, facilitating, and I'm assuming coaching as well, because these are 3 great areas of coaching. You seem helping people out in these 3 different phases. If I look at the Glenda of today, and the Glenda of when you started, 3 more decades ago, what advice would the Glenda of today give the Glenda of 30 years ago?
I love that question. And it's nice to go back and visit her sometimes. There are a lot of things, but one I think might be most is to choose your path and not to let your path choose you. To choose your path, to be conscious of where you are and what's happening and where you might choose to go, and not just to let the stream of life pick you up and carry you hither and yon. And so to be intentional in your choices, whether it's professional choices or personal choices, but to be conscious of them. And then I think second is to be kind, to be honest, but to be kind. So as I look back over my life at the things that I wish I could have changed, there were moments when I should have been kinder.
And is there any of this advice that you can let leak into a workshop of yours, that choose your path or be kind or something else?
Oh, isn't that fascinating? I could explicitly, but I think I do implicitly with everything that I teach.
Mhm.
Because one of the fundamental beliefs in HSD, it's a normative truth, maybe not an objective truth, is that you're responsible for your own adaptive action. That you can't do someone else's work, but that you can be aware and intentional and active about your own. And so in that way, I really focus on helping people build the capacity to make choices for themselves and to be intentional so they don't feel like victims, but so that they're taking action. And I also hope that kindness is an underlying theme of the way that I engage with people and what I invite people into when they're in a room with me. So I think implicitly they're both there every moment. I never thought about making them explicit. Maybe I will make them more explicit.
That would be interesting. Yeah. And so, Glenda, as we draw to a close, I want to ask you so many more questions, but I'm just going to restrict it to one or two, maybe. Just looking at my notes here, you mentioned Habermas, right, as one of your go-tos for the truths. As facilitators, as educators, what would you advise somebody to read? Maybe a book or a person, a white paper. Um, what's something that anyone dealing in learning could go to and read and really help them?
Well, if people are interested to know more about adaptive action and the tools that we use to support adaptive capacity, the best book to read is a book that Royce Holiday and I wrote together called Adaptive Action, Leveraging Uncertainty in Your Organization.
Adaptive action, leveraging uncertainty in your organization.
Organization.
Royce Holiday and
Holladay is the second author, and I'm the first author. And it's a guidebook to doing the work, human systems dynamics in all kinds of situations. So that's one that could be really useful. Another book that I have found quite useful is yeah. So I'm thinking about several that I really like. So there've been many books recently about dialogue and holding dialogue. And just about anything that you read about practices in dialogue are useful.
Okay. And as we close, is there any last message that you'd like to leave our fellow facilitators, educators, coaches, designers? But
Well, I want to say thank you, Greg, for this opportunity to dig deeply and to appreciate the way that you are learning in action in the moments. And I believe that that is just such a lovely model for what it means to be a good facilitator or a good teacher or a good human being, is to be constantly in that space of inquiry and having and recognizing and speaking to the ahas that you feel. So I believe that that is kind of the nature and core of what a good facilitator teacher can be. And so I really appreciate the way you model that in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Glenda. And it's been, as always, and um, this is the second time we've had you on the show. So as always, it's a treat speaking with you. And yes, there's a lot of learning. So I had my notes preparing up for this talk, and I've also made another 2 pages of notes as I've been speaking with you. So yes, thank you for that. Thank you for making the time, and looking forward to having a chat with you sometime in the future.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next time.
Thank you.